When you were talking about worries about climate change data, it's like, who can blame you, really? There's so much information out there. It's hard to know what to believe. So that's what we're looking at today. Like, could climate science be manipulated? Especially the models that predict, future warming and all that. And before we get too far into it, the source we're looking at today, Eingeführter Text, uses this term, feasibility probe, which basically means, is this even possible? So could climate research be manipulated? I mean, technically,
Yeah.
I guess. Could it be totally accurate? Yeah, that's possible too. But here's the thing, right? People hear manipulation and their minds immediately jump to hoax, or they just dismiss the whole thing. We're going for something a little different. We want to be like informed skeptics. We're not here to debunk or endorse anything. We just want to see what's what. It's interesting. The source compares this whole thing to that fake pandemic idea. Not that they believe it, but they're saying it would be way easier to mess with climate models than to fake whole pandemic. Think about it. A pandemic, that's millions of people, hospitals, people actually dying. But a model, it's just data and code. And that's what makes this whole thing a little creepy. The source says even if 99.9% of climate science is legit, messing with that tiny 0.1%, that could throw everything off. It's like a tiny drop of, I don't know, poison in a gallon of water. You'd never know it was there, but
Yeah, it could be really bad.
exactly. And at the center of all this is what they call the master computer model, the one that predicts how much hotter it's going to get based on CO2 emissions. And this isn't just some, thought experiment. This thing has real-world consequences.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this model is the basis for huge policy decisions. We're talking carbon taxes, how we invest in renewable energy, international agreements, the whole 9 yards. Trillions of dollars are on the line here. And it all comes down to how accurate this model is.
Right. And even a small error could be a really big deal.
Exactly. The economic and social impacts.
Now,
Huge.
the source puts it like this. Imagine driving a little bit over the speed limit, like almost every time you get behind the wheel. 999 times out of 1,000, no problem. But it's that one time you get pulled over, or worse, that really matters. And climate, that's like the most complex system out there. Even the smallest mistake in the model could snowball into a huge problem. It's like that Volkswagen emissions thing a while back.
Oh, right.
Talk about subtle manipulation, but with huge consequences. The source even talks about how programmers have these underhanded techniques that are almost impossible to detect. And even if you do find them, good luck proving it was intentional.
And that's why it's so important to understand how this master computer model even works, because it's not just one thing. It uses data from tons of smaller models, each one looking at a specific piece of climate change. Oceans, clouds, ice sheets, everything. It's crazy complicated.
So it's like all these little models feeding into one giant model.
Exactly. Like a giant clock where every tiny gear has to work perfectly. If even one of those smaller models is off, the whole thing could be wrong.
And to really show just how complex this is, the source talks about something you'd think would be super simple, measuring sea level rise.
Yeah, you'd think.
You would think it's just like ocean goes up, sea level rises, done. But it's way more complicated. They're using satellites, lasers, reference frames, which is like how we even define where our measurements are taken. It's wild.
And that complexity is exactly why even the tiniest difference matters. We're talking millimeters here, not meters.
Yeah.
The source talks about how even a few millimeters of difference in sea level rise, but over decades, centuries, huge consequences. Think about coastal cities, island nations, entire ecosystems. It could be devastating.
And the source says there are differences between different ways of measuring, which makes it even more uncertain.
Exactly.
So it's not just about whether the sea level is rising, it's how accurately we can predict it. And it makes you wonder about the other stuff that goes into these models. Like, the source is also worried about how accurate ocean temperature data is.
Yeah, that's a big one.
They say we're relying too much on measurements taken at the surface, and there's not enough data from deep down in the ocean. They even compare it to, using one single thermometer to figure out the temperature of an entire country.
It makes you think, right? If the basic data about ocean temperatures, which is like a huge part of climate, if that data is not reliable, how can we trust the overall climate model? We could be making trillion-dollar decisions based on incomplete information. It'd be like
Building a skyscraper on a foundation that's half-assed.
basically.
Speaking of shaky foundations, the source also talks about that ClimateGate hacking thing back in 2009. Remember that? At the University of East Anglia?
Oh,
Now, whatever you think about what was in those emails, the source makes a really good point. The code they used for some of those climate models, the code that's being used to make huge decisions, it was a mess. Poorly documented, no real independent auditing, the whole deal.
And that lack of transparency is a problem. I mean, might not be manipulation, but it definitely doesn't make you trust it. It's like using a recipe where some of the ingredients and steps are missing. You might get a cake, but who knows if it's the right cake?
Well,
And we're not talking about cake here. We're talking about climate change.
exactly. We need to be able to see what's going on.
100%.
And that leads to this idea that the source talks about, the butterfly effect. You know that thing about how a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil and it causes a tornado in Texas?
Oh, yeah, classic chaos theory.
Right. Small changes can have huge, unpredictable consequences.
Right.
And climate. That's
Yeah.
like the definition of a complex system, right?
Definitely.
So if something as small as a butterfly flapping its wings can theoretically change the weather, how can we be sure that our climate models are taking everything into account? Every single butterfly, so to speak.
It really makes you think about how much we're relying on these models to get it right, to tell us what's going to happen in the future.
Right, like how accurate can they really be?
And it's not that they're totally useless. It's just that we need to be, I don't know, a bit cautious, like the source says, a healthy dose of skepticism is a good thing.
So not dismissing the science, but understanding that it has limits.
Exactly. Asking the tough questions like, how good is the data going into these models? How transparent are they with their methods? And how much uncertainty are we willing to accept when the stakes are this high?
It's about understanding uncertainty, right? Because as the source points out, uncertainty is just part of science, especially with something as complicated as climate change. It's like trying to predict where a leaf is going to land when it falls from a tree on a windy day.
Yeah.
You can guess, but you can't know for sure.
Nope, you just can't.
So how do we deal with that uncertainty, especially with something as important as climate change? What does it mean for us, for the listener? That's what we'll get into in the next part of our deep dive.
And that's what makes the source's next point so interesting. They bring up that whole ClimateGate thing from 2009. Remember that?
Oh yeah, how could I forget? It was everywhere. Leaked emails, scientists accused of messing with data. It was crazy.
Right. And even though those scientists were eventually cleared of the worst stuff, the source says there's still something to think about. They point out that the code they used for some of those climate models, the actual code that's influencing global policies, it was a mess, like poorly documented, no real independent checks, the whole 9 yards.
So even if everyone had the best intentions, if the code's a disaster, it's almost impossible to check the results or figure out where things went wrong, right?
Exactly. It's like trying to follow a recipe that someone scribbled on a napkin in a messy kitchen. You might get lucky and bake a decent cake, but good luck figuring out what went wrong if it falls flat or trying to make it again. And we're not talking about cake here. We're talking about decisions that could affect the entire planet.
So being transparent isn't just about being ethical. It's about making sure the science itself holds up.
Exactly. And this leads into a really important idea that the source keeps coming back to, the butterfly effect. Have you heard of that?
Oh, absolutely. The whole thing about a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil, causing a tornado in Texas, right? Classic chaos theory, how a tiny change in a huge complex system can have massive, crazy consequences.
Right. And you can see where I'm going with this, right? If a butterfly's wings can, theoretically mess with the weather, how on earth can we be sure that our climate models are taking everything into account, every single butterfly? It's mind-boggling.
It really makes you realize how much we depend on these models to be right, to predict the future accurately.
Right. And look, climate models are getting better, but they're still just representations of a reality that is way more complicated than we can fully understand. The source isn't saying climate change is fake or that these models are useless. They're just saying we need to be a bit careful, maybe a little skeptical.
So not ignoring the science, but understanding that it has its limits.
Exactly. Asking those tough questions. How confident are we in the data that's going into these models? Are they being open about how they're doing things? And really, how much uncertainty are we okay with when the stakes are this high?
And that seems to be the key thing here, understanding uncertainty. Because, like the source says, uncertainty is just a part of science, especially something as complex as climate science. It's like trying to predict where a single leaf is going to land when it falls from a tree on a windy day. You can make a guess, but...
You can't know for sure.
Exactly. So how do we handle that uncertainty, especially with something as crucial as climate change? What does this all mean for you, the listener? That's what we'll explore in the last part of our deep dive.
Yep.
So we've talked about how complex these climate models are, how they could be manipulated, why transparency is so important, and how uncertainty is just part of the game. But what does it all mean for, the average person?
That's the big question, right? And the source we've been looking at doesn't exactly give us a straight answer, but it does offer some interesting things to think about.
Like what? Give us something to, I don't know, ponder over our morning coffee.
Well, they make this point that, like, just because climate science has limitations doesn't mean we should just ignore the whole thing. It's more about being smart about the information we consume, you know?
Yeah.
Asking critical questions instead of just believing whatever we read or hear.
Which is harder than it sounds these days, right?
Yeah.
We're constantly bombarded with information.
Totally. And that's why the source says it's really important to, like, think about who's giving us this information, who funded the research, what are their biases, are they being open about their data and methods?
Well, it's like anything else, right?
Yeah.
Do your homework. Don't just believe something because it has a fancy chart or a catchy slogan.
Exactly. That's where, like, informed skepticism comes in. It's not about being cynical or saying the science is wrong. It's about looking at it with a critical eye.
Which brings us back to that original question, right? If you were the one calling the shots, spending billions, trillions of dollars based on these climate models, how much certainty would you need?
That's a great question, because when you get down to it, decisions about climate change, like investing in renewable energy, carbon taxes, even just changing our own habits, it affects all of us.
It's about weighing the risks and benefits, thinking about what might happen if we do something or if we don't.
Absolutely. And being humble enough to admit that we don't have all the answers.
So where do we go from here?
That's the journey, isn't it? To stay curious, keep asking the hard questions, and never stop trying to understand the world around us, especially when the answers are complicated and constantly changing.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, we hope this has given you the tools to navigate this crazy world of climate science, data, and, the search for certainty. Until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and keep digging deeper.